Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the show where we put our property experts to task answering your questions. And joining me today is Jermyn, CEO and Solicitor at Woodstock Legal Services, residential landlord and tenant law specialist.
It's a long one, thank you.
It is a long one, isn't it? I'm going to speak to you about this at some point in time. Okay, well, welcome, Carly, anyway. Joining Carly is Humphries, CEO of Brickflow, the digital marketplace for specialist property finance. Welcome to you, Ian.
Hi, Stephen. Good to see you.
Good to have you both back, and we'll get straight on with the questioning. I'm going to start with you, Ian. I'm at the present time preparing an application for financing my next development project. I have not before experienced the huge escalation of prices in building materials. How would the experts suggest that I present that in my application, i.e. seeking flexibility without causing concerns over profit potential?
Yeah, okay, so lenders generally are going to have a minimum profit they expect from each project. And that does vary from region to region, project to project. But they also will need to know that your build costs are correct and accurate to fulfill the project. I think where you are starting to see perhaps some flexibility around it is where the borrower is potentially going to keep the properties at the end. So you're seeing a lot more developers, 10 years ago, almost everyone you would speak to, they would be developing to sell, whereas now you see probably slightly more developing to retain. And a couple of reasons for that. I think obviously the change in stamp duty, meaning the entrance to as a buy-to-let landlord now, you pay an extra 3% surcharge. So not only is it cheaper to build property than to buy, so there's a saving there, but also there's the 3% entry surcharge on each property.
So let me just stop there. So if you're a contractor, developer, limited company, you keep your product.
Yeah.
What's the stamp duty implication there?
Well, you only pay the stamp duty on the initial land. So you pay on a much smaller. If say you buy a piece of land for £1 million, you pay stamp duty on £1 million. If each of your flats is 500,000, there's 10 of them.
Not on the product.
Exactly. You'd pay the stamp duty on the individual unit prices. So for a lot of developers, it's a cheaper way to get into becoming a landlord.
Is there so let's say as a developer that you do that, you build 50 flats, you keep 10 of them, you don't pay the stamp duty on that 10 because they're already in your ownership.
Yep.
What happens if in 5 years down the line you sell them? Does that attract stamp duty?
Only for the buyers.
To the buyers.
Units. Yeah,
There's no sort of retrospective clawback or anything.
Exactly, no. So you're starting to see lenders be more sensitive to the fact that when people retain them, they don't need as much profit margin because they expect to make money from the rental that they're going to receive going forward. So that's one way that you can mitigate. But ultimately, if the build costs have escalated and the GDV has not changed and your profit margin is being squeezed, then the land price needs to change. And if you already own the land, or if you already paid for it, or you bought it under option, then you might not have the flexibility to reduce that. But certainly if you're in today's market and you found your build costs have escalated, your GDV is flatlined or perhaps is coming down, then you need to go back and renegotiate your land price. Because, and this is a conversation I've had with multiple friends and property developers, is if you're going through a period, let's say we've had in recent times where the base rate has gone up significantly over a very short period of time, the extra cost per million of borrowing is £2,500 per year for each 0.25% increase in the base rate. Base rate's gone up 5%, so it's extra £50,000 per million of borrowing. The average development in the UK development loan is about 5 million, so it's an extra 250,000 of interest you're carrying every single year through your development. So that really needs to come off of the land price. So I think renegotiating land price is really important. There's other methods, techniques you can use. You can look at overage within your contract. So you can offer the seller an incentive to sell to you at a reduced price, But if profit comes up above a certain level, then you'll make a secondary payment to them. So there are ways around it, but ultimately, build costs have gone up. Your land price needs to go down.
The sort of difficulty I can sort of visualise is that if you, let's say you've got a sort of multi-unit development, 50 units or something, and you start that marketing on completion, it's very important you get your lender to be very clear with you about what they expect to receive from the proceeds of sale as that number of units comes down.
Yeah, I mean, for the initial part of the loan, they'll expect 100% of the proceeds. So most lenders will contractually stipulate that the first X number of units, 100%. Perhaps when they get to a more comfortable leverage, maybe 50%, then they'll allow a smaller amount to be redeemed on each loan. But this is why when people do look to retain, they might need to sell the first tranche and then retain the difference. Unless, of course, the rental drives enough long-term debt to buy out the development finance, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Not easy being a developer, is it?
It's not. There's a lot of people shooting at them from all different angles.
Yeah. I know, in the past we've always had this thing, the developer can afford this, the developer can afford that, but it's
tight margins, and that fluctuation in through the cycle is huge. It can wipe you out.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ian. Carly, with court days stretching further and further into the distance, frustrating landlords who are seeking assistance from the courts, is there an argument for increasing the powers and scope of tiered tribunals, i.e. purely specialised courts for property matters?
Yeah, I mean, there was huge amounts of discussion prior to the draft bill about there being a housing court. We haven't seen that. That doesn't seem to have moved on. Whatever you do, whether you do it in the courts or the tribunals, I think it's going to be incredibly important that you have more specialists, or at least judges are educated about the reform so they can make informed and very quick. You're in there for a 15-minute hearing, so they really need to know what they're talking about.
They do.
And it can be incredibly frustrating. And you have to understand that sometimes a judge is, may have been sat on family cases the day before, and then it's housing. So wherever you do it, whether it's in the county court or it's in tribunals, then it's really important that they have the education is there, and that they can make those quick and informed decisions. But that's the problem you've got, and it's access to justice, which is a concern. If you're going to do one housing court or several housing courts, rather than everybody being able to go to their local county court, then you perhaps have an access to justice issue for tenants, because it's very difficult for a lot of tenants to travel across the city, even
in London.
Off. Yeah, when they've got, they're supposed to be at work to paying these rent arrears, they've got children. I've been in court before and people have had to bring their children to court, and it's not a place for children. So I think, you've got to be mindful of access to justice, but I think it's incredibly important. I mean, there are huge other issues going on with the court functionality and their use of technology. They're very behind. They're very archaic. So huge investment is needed, and education of the judiciary is one thing, but technology and processes and getting them up to speed, up to date, with how we all operate in the private sector is incredibly important, because they are so far behind.
I'm afraid my experience is limited really to criminal matters rather than housing matters in court, but I have seen, talked to, and sometimes advised judges on various situations that they've come across. And I have to say, I don't wish to question the competence of any sort of county court judges, but some of their knowledge of property matters is very limited.
Yeah.
And I do worry, because the problem that you get in all courts is that you sit there adjudicating and you assume everybody has the same knowledge as you, and you're very dismissive about questions about it. But actually, a tenant in court, which comes back to your access to justice, a tenant in court is really on the back foot, isn't he or she? Because they just don't know the law.
Yeah.
They're there fighting for their home. Whether it's a good cause or a bad cause doesn't matter. It should be heard.
Yeah, and one of the proposals of reforms is to make sure they have also got more support, and I fully support that. When we're acting for landlords, if we've got a tenant that is in receipt of advice, most of the time we can have a more sensible conversation, and you can quite often avoid court. We quite often surrender tenancies. It's a sensible looking at a commercial solution for our landlords. And that normally is much easier when a tenant's in receipt of advice, rather than burying their heads in the sand or not showing up at the hearing. When you've got a slow court system, if you can have an early conversation with people that are supporting them, it's much easier.
Yeah, but I don't know, in a county court, do they have duty lawyers?
Yeah, they do. Yeah,
Okay.
A shelter charity will often be there. But they're looking to really ramp that up. And the new the How to Rent guide, that's just been released, has got more information there for tenants. Whether they read it is another matter. But they do know their rights. There's a huge amount of information out there. And that's the problem we've had for many, many years, is the tenants that know their rights and play the game, which can slow things down. So that can be quite tricky for landlords to navigate sometimes.
The other thing is that I don't know how you guys are coping with this, but it seems to me that the court dates are now so far in the future that often the problem has almost solved itself, with the exception of arrears and the money side of it, before it gets to court.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not seeing that. We're seeing the problem just escalating. And that's a real concern for tenants as well, because actually, if you're not able to pay that judgment debt, quite often they're just looking for support from the local authority to move them on. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then if you start to look at when they remove Section 21, previously, there's lots of landlords that would have gone for Section 21 so that their tenant didn't get a judgment against them, because they're more reasonable than people give them credit for. And actually, where they've previously used Section 21, they will have to use Section 8, and there will be a county court judgment for rent arrears. So you'll see tenants, having to travel around with a CCJ on their backs for,
and that can be restrictive in terms of them getting a new tenancy.
Exactly. So there's all sorts of problems, and there's huge problems of antisocial behaviour. Again, they would have just gone through Section 21 now. With that removed, they'll have to look at Section 8.
Okay, thank you both for that. That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break, and we'll be asking more questions of our esteemed guests. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm joined by Ian Humphries and Carla Jermyn. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Ian, obviously a developer has to calculate sales rates, and in doing so must ensure that his product meets mortgage requirements to guarantee success, which sometimes can be difficult. Why is it that development lenders are rarely interested in also providing retail mortgages for the development that they've just financed? Why is that?
Well, they do in certain circumstances. So firstly, if the developer's retaining them, as we talked about before, then there are a number of lenders that will happily lend for the term mortgage as well. I think what you need to think about is each bank or each lender, not all of them, but they will lend on these assets, but it's different departments, right? So you have a development finance department, you have a bridging finance, you have commercial mortgages, you have residential, you have buy-to-let. So these departments don't always speak to one another, surprisingly. But also, if the developer is selling these units to end buyers, then the end buyer has to have the freedom of choice of being able to mortgage with whoever they want. But certainly, if the developer is going to retain some of the units, then there are a number of lenders that are wise to this and will help them retain. But where you see it perhaps more commonly is in student accommodation and hotels. So these assets, once they're built, you have what you call the stabilisation period. So you might have a period of time, 2-3 years post-construction, where you're building up your tenancy or you're building up your income before you can go on to a regular term mortgage. So what you might find on a hotel or student accommodation site is the development lender will give you a 5-year loan term, of which 2 years is construction and 3 years is stabilisation term out. And then after that period, you can refinance with them, or you can move it on to a different lender.
Yeah, but just going back in my development days down here, you build a development. Let's say you've got 200 or 300 units in the one block. From morning till night, you just spend arguing with valuers about what the value of those each individual flats are for your end customers. almost to the point of coming to blows sometimes, and you're having to call senior partners of the valuers in to discuss it and ask the reason why they're 30% less than the last one or whatever else. And it's just always occurred to me that it's a bit of an unnecessary fight, really. If your lender has lent you the money to build the wretched thing, why doesn't he lend the people that want to buy them the money to buy them?
I think certainly with the development finance, the way it's structured within the bank is that quick turn of capital. So there's not, it's more the retail banks that have that savings deposit base where they can do longer term mortgages. But a lot of the sort of development space is, short term money.
So really it's the way the lender borrows his money.
Yeah, but in a lot of cases, absolutely. That they are only set up to do that short-term debt.
Yeah, okay. Carly, just an interesting point there. So I know your specialism is in buy-to-let. How is funding in the buy-to-let market at the moment?
I don't know, actually, because I don't actually get involved in that aspect. We have to pass the buck on that.
You must have your customers come in and start cursing about the...
I mean, the issue that loads of us face, we're obviously seeing a lot of landlords exiting, and there are two reasons. There are the reforms, and then there's the rise in the cost of mortgage payments, so against the rent, and actually the hassle factor involved. So that is, I can see that concern.
I mean, rates are coming down, Stephen. They're certainly a lot more competitive than where they were even just 3 months ago. And you're also starting to see some innovation within the buy-to-let sector. So lenders being less concerned with the coverage ratio of over and above the mortgage payment. So they're perhaps reducing that in certain circumstances.
What would a typical overage need to be there?
So normally it's 125% on a 5-year fixed rate. But there is, I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure I saw a headline recently that there are lenders now that will be at 110 or 100% even. But what they're looking for is what you'd call top slicing. So your income supports that additional coverage. So they'll look at the holistic situation where you've got your residential mortgage debt, and let's say you covered that 2 times with your income, then the lender would judge that you have sufficient surplus to then cover a potential shortfall on the buy-to-let.
Okay.
But what you're tending to see as well is lenders just reducing the rate and adding a lot more onto the fees. So whereas when rates were much lower, you might pay 1 or 2% and an interest rate. I've seen something recently where the lender's charging a 7% arrangement fee, but then depressing the rate to such a level that you can borrow more against your property on that coverage ratio.
I think that's more helpful in a way, isn't it? Because, okay, even if you're paying a heavier arrangement fee, it's just a quantifiable cost, isn't it? Which you can build into your business
it's offset
plan.
Against the debt, and if you're in a company, there's obviously tax benefits to that. So you're paying the same amount of money. It's just whether you pay it up front or you pay it each month. And some people would prefer the cash flow.
Yeah. Today, tomorrow, sometime never.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Carly, your final question of the show. The new leasehold regulations originally proposed by the government seem now to be diluted, delayed, and in some cases discarded. What do the experts think the chances of these new regulations actually being introduced, and if so, when?
I mean, who knows? It's even further behind the rental reforms, isn't it? So is it just sound bites? I don't know. We're expected to know more at the next King's Speech, which I think is the 7th of November. So it's, get your ear to the ground until then, you carry on as normal, I think is the advice. So we shall see.
But I don't know how you guys do advise when things are so fluid.
Difficult. It's incredibly difficult. And that's the problem we have is, the upset in the market because, it's very difficult to advise. People don't know whether they should be doing things now. Should they look to extend? Should they wait? And I think you can only advise on how the law is now and keeping a really close eye on to proposed changes as and when they're announced. But you've got to remember, still, even when you get a draft bill, it's got to go through a first reading, a second reading, a third reading. So there's always, it can be huge amounts of changes, and that process can take a long time. So.
Well, I was talking to somebody the other day, it was absolutely boiling, who sold their buy-to-let portfolio because they knew that their properties would be incredibly expensive to reach the new, energy efficiency levels. And he said, I listened to the man on the TV who's just scrapped it.
Yes. Yeah, incredibly frustrating. Great for those that are still in the market, but I can see the absolute frustration there. And that's the concern it's causing. And that's why, it's decisions like that, or lack of decisions, that you're forcing landlords to exit, because it's so uncertain and so unknown. And when you want to, invest and you've got your asset, you need to protect it. So when you don't have that certainty, that becomes very difficult, which has caused a huge amount of problems. So you've got landlords exiting, which then drives up the rents, which is,
well, it's almost
supply and demand problem.
It's almost a double whammy, isn't it? I mean, we know that you cannot have a pension made up of residential properties. We know that. That's just not revenue law. But what you can do, of course, is have a buy-to-let property as your pension. That's fair enough. And again, I see a lot of people who have done that. They now say they've been so squeezed on the margins. They were terrified of these new regulations coming in, which would involve really heavy conversion costs and things like that. They're selling up, and really that's just going to put a burden on either pension costs or support costs for people as they become older. I mean, I just don't get what the thinking is.
Short-termist, isn't it? Very short-termist.
Yeah. Perhaps you can't introduce long-term policies if you're only in power for 4 years. Perhaps that's the fundamental fault.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's even quicker now, right? I mean,
so in the first 2 years,
exactly,
you've got
the Conservatives. We've got 3 prime ministers in a year.
Yeah.
So you don't even get that long now.
I don't think any of them were elected.
No.
I do think the penny is dropping a little bit with the Conservative government with the rental reforms. So, I'm feeling a little bit more positive at the moment, and they're really recognising, Michael Gove has spoken about really recognising the value of the private rental sector. And that for a while has been sort of kicked under the rug. But it is incredibly valuable, and they've got to give it, and good landlords the respect they deserve, and recognise that they're, doing a good job, and they're quite within their rights to invest in buy-to-let property and offer great properties to tenants that need them.
Well, I mean, you can go back to the late 80s. Margaret Thatcher brought in the assured short-hold tenancies, which transformed the private letting market, didn't it? It saved the government, must have been in billions, on providing homes through council homes and things like that. People could have their own property. They could rent properly and securely without, wicked landlords, interfering in their lives and things. So, I mean, it's all been counterproductive.
See, I think it's a minority as well. Like most things, there's a minority that have kind of spoiled it for the majority.
Yeah, and I do think some tweaks are needed, some rebalancing, and there are some changes that are needed. But I think, it's quite a drastic proposal that's caused a lot of upset. And then we've not moved far enough forward for people to have that certainty.
And is this because people haven't thought it through?
It's complex.
Or don't they know?
Everybody, conflicting views, and it is complex. And like I say, I think, in theory, I don't have any issue with Section 21 going, because that's become very complicated. I don't have any concern with people having their day in court if the court system can deal with it. But it can't in its current form.
Right. Just very quickly, in 2 seconds, Carly, the sort of replacement, if you like, or the stock replacement is going to be sort of Section 8, is it?
Yes.
Isn't that a bit draconian? Because it's not discretionary, is it?
Well, there's a multitude of the variety of grounds. It depends what you're looking at. I think the biggest concern is antisocial behaviour, because whilst it's mandatory for them to award it, you've got to present that to a court, and gathering evidence of antisocial behaviour, incredibly difficult. You're asking people to turn up at court and give evidence of their neighbour that they're saying is antisocial, and go back and live next door to them at the end if it doesn't go their way. So, and
it's the same as those antisocial behaviour orders, they never worked. Really.
Incredibly difficult. And that's why Section 21 was a really great mechanism for antisocial behaviour. It gave landlords, the reality is a landlord does not want to evict a tenant if they are paying their rent and they're behaving. And even sometimes landlords aren't as bothered about antisocial behaviour as the neighbourhood might be. So you need to be able to give landlords and the neighbourhood a mechanism to remove these people without, fear of repercussions for themselves.
Okay, well, there we are. That's all we've got time for. So big thank you to Carly Jermyn, CEO and solicitor at Woodstock Legal Services. I'm not reading all of it out. And Ian Humphries, CEO of Brickflow, digital marketplace for specialist property finance. Thank you both very much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen.
Really great answers. Thank you. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time, and thank you for watching.